Hi there. I'm just going to talk about a few things that are on my mind. Um, I watched the Paul Vanderklay, John Vervaeke dialogue. That was good. I'm going to talk about parts of self. I'm going to talk about the Overton window, a couple of quotes by C.S. Lewis, and a quote by Robert Pirsig on morality. The first thing I want to say has to do with the recent video Paul Vanderklay put out in which John Vervaeke critiques his PowerPoint on personhood and why relate to a personal God. So they were talking about how they trust each other and how they can talk to each other better than they can some people who presumably share their same belief systems. And this goes back to something that really has a lot of impact on me, and that's the Overton window and the way the Overton window is structured. The top of the Overton window, well, the way that people arrive at their conclusions in this way of looking at things is more important than their actual conclusions, and I'll get into that. And the top of the Overton window is authoritarian, so let's update that in the language of metaphysics of quality. They're rigid patterns of value. That's on the top. So the classic and romantic say, or the religious and the secular are forever divided. It takes dynamic quality to push people down to the other side, to the libertarian side. And I know the use of the word libertarian is a loaded one. And so just look at the top, just look at the Overton window as rigid and dynamic. So if you are in a value trap, and this is a Pirsig concept of one of the things that really trips you up, I'm going to go a lot more into this because it's very important, but let's just call it a value trap. And this is how Pirsig refers to a defense of your position. There's a lot of ego involved in this, and what all you're trying to do is, if you're stuck in a value trap where your value system is rigid, is you're trying to convince the other person using standard subject-object rationality. And this may work in some instances if you just happen to come across some kind of fact, and you're doing this with facts that you believe to be representative of your position. And if you come across a fact that fortuitously has an underlying value that you share, it can work, but more likely this leads to strife, and that defeats the purpose anyway, because really you're looking at shared values for one. But if you're using the sum total of your knowledge and your biology and your temperament and your culture, your boxcars, let's say, in Pirsig's metaphor of the train, the boxcars on the track of quality, in conjunction with your relationship to quality, then you can talk to anyone who's doing the same thing, who's using quality to push the train forward of their boxcars that may be very different from yours. You're updating your values in relationship to the other person, and this is why I think that Paul Vanderklay and John Vervaeke can speak more meaningful to each other than they can to some of their colleagues who share their same belief system, their same static patterns of value. So remember, in the metaphysics of quality, relationship is all there is. Everything is in relationship. And the dynamism is what unites all these thinkers that are inspiring this corner of the internet. Have you ever, for example, one of these thinkers, I think, is Robert Sapolsky. I think he's he studies apes in Africa, but he's also he's a number of things. One thing, of course, is he's a biologist, and that's a broad term, I guess. But okay, let's just say Robert Sapolsky is one of them. And if you've read that book, what do you notice about the book? For one thing, it's not one discipline. He calls them buckets. Not one discipline can explain the whole thing. You can't use a rational knife and pick one of those elements and explain the totality of human behavior on a biological framework. He uses, I think, neuroscience, molecular biology, genetics, and evolution, and there may be another one. These disciplines have relationship to each other and within themselves. They are just ways of kind of explaining these things without being the definitive thing that explains them. And things are always changing. And you'll notice that in his book, the dynamism. Like, for example, we're all, talking about testosterone does this, that, and the other thing. Well, testosterone does a whole lot of things, some of which are totally not related to masculinity or masculine behavior or aggressive behavior and all that stuff. Here's another example. So he says in the East, there is a genetic proclivity for wanting to be in a group, a collective sort of, a gene for collectivism, I guess. And in the West, there's more of a individual genetic profile wanting to be, or gene wanting to be your own agent. But this proclivity can be drastically reduced within a generation or two if a person moves from the East or West, and vice versa. So Steven Pinker, this is an example of a non-dynamic thinker. Steven Pinker, despite his genius, and I appreciate a lot of his work, I like The Blank Slate a lot, but he's probably the new bugaboo over here in this corner ever since Jonathan Pageau's brilliant critique of his book, Enlightenment Now. That is a perfect example of someone, despite, again, his brilliance, stuck in rigid subject-object thinking, stuck in a static pattern of value in which the classic rationality is the highest good. And so he says, just be rational and everything will be great. So rational is really the question here, because what we are is a big elephant with a little rider. This big elephant of emotion and spontaneous expression, and a rider who's doing the rational work for the elephant, keeping him from making a bunch of serious mistakes. And that's how it should be. And the little rider needs to be guiding the elephant really on the path of quality, not trying to tame it. But really we're a lot of elephants, and each of these little elephants is sort of circling around an emotion. Using, of course, Putnam's way of describing the parts of self, sort of circling around like anger, fear. There was sort of that's going to be a sub-personality, roughly. I mean, obviously, it's not that cut and dry. So that brings up something that Paul said in his rough draft for Sunday, which is, we are all legion. Yes, this is very true. And this is, of course, is an ongoing theme for me. So we're looking, let's just say we're looking for a solution to this. Not that being fragmented, not that having subpersonalities is a problem per se, but if we were to need a solution to this, Paul pointed out to a person that is revered by his church who is the same no matter where she is. So that's cohesion versus fragmentation. And fragmentation of parts of self is where a lot of the problem is, especially when, let's go back to memory, especially when one part doesn't have the link of a good memory link with the other part. And there's a lot of reasons that could happen, that the glue that holds the parts together is not so sticky. And so if you have fragmentation, the parts are at war with each other. There's inner conflict. And I think getting to know your parts well is a really good strategy. That means each part gets its say and it's understood. And you can do this. You can, if you're honest with yourself, you can get a sense of what your parts are. And I'm going to go into this more. I think this would be a valuable thing to discuss. So some of the negative feelings you have that just come out of the blue are simply parts of you that you have are rejected and are getting back at the system of your totality for marginalizing them, which we often do with what we characterize as our objectionable parts. And just a hint, there's often two in particular that emerge. One is the child part that received, let's just say, suboptimal love, didn't receive enough agape. And the other one is the teenager that hates the child's vulnerability, but also hates the world for what it has done to the child, and projects onto the world much more malevolence than is actually there. But these parts need understanding from you, your cohesive totality, which you have access to if you really get to know your parts. Everyone has one part that can cohere. I have a theorist I really like. I'll mention her later, but she calls it the grown-up self, the going on with the life self. I'll mention her anyway. Her name's Janina Fisher, and that part does the managing of this. So that part can actually have the dialogue with the parts that you have marginalized, if you can get to know that part too. And this is kind of a simplistic way of explaining shadow work. So a viewer called Paul Wagner left a comment yesterday or this morning, I'm not sure when, on my ZAM reading video. And they are some quotes from both Pirsig and C.S. Lewis. And I want to talk about them because he's really addressing the problem the spiritual problem that I'm struggling with. Okay, so, and I talked a little bit about morality in this ZAM reading, kind of in a not a very coherent way, I'm afraid, but it has to do with the more advanced metaphysics of quality, and I'm not adept in that yet. But there is a morality question that can be addressed by the metaphysics of quality, or it can be addressed by theism, or it can be addressed in conjunction with each other, which is kind of what I'm going for. So the first quote is from Pirsig. Because quality is morality, make no mistake about it. They're identical. And if quality is the primary reality of the world, then it means morality is also the primary reality of the world. The world is primarily in moral order, but it's a moral order that neither Rigel, this is a character in Lila, nor the posing Victorians, they were mentioned in the ZAM video, the ones who prefer proper stuff to actual productive stuff, had ever in their wildest dreams thought about or heard about. Okay, so that has a lot of implications. I just want to put it out there because that is a big part of Pirsig's philosophy, is that moral order. And so then, of course, the theistic counterpart, I think, is, for me and for a lot of us here, is C.S. Lewis. I think I'm going to read this whole thing, and it's rather long, but I think it's worth it. Until modern times, no thinker of the first rank ever doubted that our judgments of value were rational judgments, or that what they've discovered was objective. It was taken for granted that in temptation, passion was opposed, not some sentiment, but to reason. Thus Plato thought, thus Aristotle, thus Hooker, Butler, and Dr. Johnson. The modern view is very different. It does not believe that value judgments are really judgments at all. They are sentiments, complexes, or attitudes produced in a community by the pressure of its environment and its traditions, and differing from one community to the other. That sounds an awful lot like postmodernism, but this is pre-postmodernism, but this is the trajectory. To say that a thing is good is merely to express our feeling about it, and our feeling about it is the feeling we have been socially conditioned to have. But if this is so, then we might have been conditioned to feel otherwise. Perhaps, thinks the reformer or the educational expert, it would be better if we were. Let us improve our morality. Out of this apparently innocent idea comes the disease that will certainly end our species, and in my view, damn our souls if it's not crushed. The fatal superstition that man can create values and that a community can choose its ideology as men choose their clothes. Okay, this is a fantastic quote, lots of implications here. I'm only going to bring up one thing here. I don't think that Pirsig, okay, so you've got in Mere Christianity, you have C.S. Lewis' moral law, which is kind of fixed, which is a static pattern of value. That's not a bad thing, but this is the dilemma, because in Pirsig, it's quality, it's the pre-intellectual quality that creates our morality, and whether we're moral or not depends on our capacity to recognize quality rather than be, as John Vervaeke says, to deceive ourselves, self-deception. All right, so this is the dilemma. Is there a moral law, or is quality morality? And if so, how are the two related? And I think that they are related. At least that's my gut reaction at this point as I work out this very complex problem. so maybe this third comment can give a way into what the solution is. If the pinnacle, the foundations, and even the structure of quality, morality, value is love, and I'm suggesting here that the ending of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is Pirsig demonstrating this, then that is Patrick talking, and then he says, he gives a short quote from C.S. Lewis. Then you do not fail in obedience through lack of love, but you have lost love because you never attempted obedience. Okay, so that's very interesting because that means that you can't just be romantic. Whatever happens, morality is relative, my feelings count. And you can't be rigid either, but you need the rigidity of obedience to what you know to be good. And that is not in conflict with Pirsig. There's a lot of discipline and obedience, let's just say, in Pirsig. And a lot of, in fact, what Pirsig recommends is 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 ways to keep yourself in that quality flow state where you will be in touch with quality and where you have access to morality. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.